Without further ado, let's get started. I would like to introduce my good friend Steve Feldstein, who currently serves as Senior Fellow for Democracy, Conflict, and Governance at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I first met Steve when he was actually in Boise as the Frank and Bethany Church Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University, after having served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And earlier in his career, he served as the Policy Director at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, as well as counsel to SFRC, or the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's been featured in nearly every international affairs publication around. You frequently hear him on television or on the radio. But I could go on and on, Steve, about your impressive background, but I'm gonna stop there to be respectful of time. But thank you again so much for being with us. Thanks for the knowledge through the book. Let me pass it to you, and love to hear from you, my friend.
Great. Well, thanks for the really warm introduction, Luke. And thanks to Luke and Tina for organizing this event, hosting me, reaching out. I really appreciate it. It's a fun place to be right now, with the book out, actually getting to see people's reactions, talking about the substance, and, kind of getting that interaction has been really gratifying to me as an author, as a first-time author, as it turns out. I mean, what's really funny and striking is that it is such a contrast to the actual research and writing process, which can be a very isolating experience, and one that at times felt like it would never end. So I'm both gratified that it's over, and I'm also gratified that I can now talk about the ideas in the book, and think about what they mean and how people are grappling with those. So that's really a great opportunity. And my only regret is that we can't see each other in person. I have been out to Phoenix a few times and always enjoy my stay out there. So hopefully in the future, in some form. So what I think I'll do, and I don't want to go on too long. I really do want to make this somewhat of an open dialogue and conversation. But I'll talk a little bit about some of the aspects to writing and undertaking the research for this book, especially when it comes to the case studies. And I also want to talk about some of the top line points as well for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it yet, or maybe have just sort of skimmed it in terms of what I think are some of the relevant ideas. But then we can really take the conversation in whatever direction you're interested in going. So why don't I start actually just in terms of how I got to the point of writing this topic and really kind of engaging in this. And so, I mean, part of the answer for that relates to a lot of what I saw, particularly in my last job in government. As Luke mentioned, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights at the State Department, and I had particular responsibility for the Africa region. And so what I ended up doing was kind of going back and forth quite a bit to a number of countries in Africa, from Nigeria to Kenya, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, many others. And what was striking to me is that on the one hand, I was really kind of working many traditional human rights issues. So I would go meet with different counterparts in ministries, occasionally even the head of state, and I would push for releases of political prisoners. I would talk about the need to respect, you have different political freedoms, freedom of expression. We talk about, armed forces accountability and not using weapons provided by different countries for bad things along those lines. But what I increasingly started to see as well was that there were new ways that governments were, using technologies to augment their political agendas. And so, I think part of what I saw was that civic groups had become really good at organizing online via social media and other means. And this was in some ways an outgrowth of what we saw with the Arab Spring. And so there was no question that when it came to where the momentum was and where the kind of energy lie, it was with, oftentimes fairly youthful protest leaders, political leaders. And it was via, hashtags and social media platforms that they were really able to rally and get populations to rise up and push back against longstanding dictators. And there was also no question that, in the process of these movements continuing to unfold, in the Africa context, that, leaders recognized that there was this growing threat. And so they were searching for ways to blunt that effect, to counteract that. And they looked for, and they sourced from a variety of places in which to do so. So certainly, and this is one of the themes I talk about a lot in the book, China and the technology that they provide, particularly in terms of the ability to enact surveillance against the communications of different dissidents, was a really important partner for some of these dictators. But many of the other technologies that companies based in in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, many of those technologies were also being used. And then there were blunter techniques. So not everything was even technologically based in terms of being able to snoop in on particular emails or text messages or social media groups. Some of it was really as blunt as cutting off the internet and just shutting down the country and its ability to transact business or to communicate in basic ways via text message, mobile phones, or otherwise for days on end. There were also more traditional tactics that were used where particular individuals who are viewed as threats to the regime, who are social media influencers, people along those lines, were targeted for arrest, for persecution, and for incarceration. And so I saw a wide variety of these tactics take place. And I even started seeing the kind of growth of disinformation and the use of more sophisticated ways to push propaganda narratives as something else that seemed to be a more and more important tactic. And so coming out of that situation, I really wanted to understand better what were some of the motivating factors behind what was occurring? What were the incentives that were being used? What were driving the use of these technologies? Were there ways to break it down? Were they more prevalent in certain types of regimes over others? Was technological capacity or the number of people who had internet connectivity related to the use of these technologies? What was kind of the driving, what was behind all these different kind of indicators? And so that kind of curiosity really drove the kind of formation of my book proposal. And so then I started trying to figure out, well, what would be the best way to tackle the subject, which by nature was immense, was global in reach. And I realized that after talking to a number of people, but I'll name one person in particular who was very influential in my thinking, was Larry Diamond, a renowned democracy scholar. I remember visiting him early on after my proposal had been accepted at his offices in Stanford, and sitting down with him and saying, well, here's my kind of idea that I'm thinking of. And at that time, what I was planning to do was to kind of walk through chapter by chapter different types of technologies and sort of talk about, this chapter would be the surveillance chapter, and this next chapter would be the censorship chapter. And he said, that's a fine way to approach it. And, I think that'll make for an interesting book, but let me throw another idea out at you. He said, what you bring in terms of your expertise and your experience is that you understand how countries work on the ground level. And he said, few others, at least at that point, have actually done in-depth case studies where you've talked to individuals and you've really tried to sift out what it is and how these technologies are being used on the ground, particularly what those political dynamics look like. And he said, if you actually try to do something where you build it off of different countries and you take field research and you do in-depth visits, that'll be something that'll make for a really interesting read. And I remember thinking, after having that conversation, I remember going back to my hotel room later that night and thinking, I think he's onto something. I think, to me, this makes a complete amount of sense that, rather than sort of make this sort of technologically based, let's talk about people, countries, political experiences, and sort of go forward in that way. And so that was really kind of the genesis for how I came up with the ultimate structure that we have in front of you with the book. And then, part of the challenge was sort of figuring out what countries I would actually go visit. And, there's a couple of different ways you can do these kind of things. So one of which is that you can pick 3 countries that are relatively similar. And then what you try to do in that case, whether they're similar in terms of region or similar in terms of political system, is you then try to look through the differences in terms of outcomes. And you try to say, well, what makes those different? And so you essentially try to control for that. Another way you can do things is you try to pick a diversity of case studies. So you try to look for places that are dissimilar and try to sort of say, well, what are the motivating factors for each one? Where's there overlap and where are there variances? And I chose the latter. I really wanted to see, I wanted to make sure that I, first of all, was able to cut across at least a couple regions. And second of all, that was able to pick a decent diversity of political systems. And so I ultimately ended up through lots of conversations and thought, and also some just, kind of opportunism in the sense that some countries were more closed off than others, some countries that had more contacts than others. But I picked Thailand because it's a country just at the time I visited, which still had a military junta that was running things, and even now it's barely kind of out of that situation. But it's a very classic authoritarian country that also has very strong traditional ties to China. And I thought that would help me get at a couple issues. How do authoritarians do it? And then what about the China link? The Philippines, what to me seemed like a no-brainer in that it's a weak democracy. It has a very charismatic leader, Rodrigo Duterte, who's running the country. And it also has sort of made inroads in terms of cultivating a stronger relationship with China, but it really is caught between a long-standing partnership with the U.S., the liberal politics of Duterte, which in of themselves is just fascinating, and a kind of a newer relationship that's developing with China. And so I thought that would be an interesting contrast regionally, particularly with Thailand. And then I wanted to go to another region. And for me, because of my prior experience living at one point and working with sub-Saharan Africa, I thought picking a country, and at that point I was really looking at most likely Kenya or Ethiopia in sub-Saharan Africa would make a lot of sense. And Ethiopia really just was a country that was kind of gripping me, and it still is. I mean, it's actually in the last year taken a sharp turn for the worse, and it's currently facing a civil war essentially in the northern part of the country. And the leader of Ethiopia, the president Abiy Ahmed, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, and for a minute was really viewed as sort of this transcendent figure who was going to change things for the better in the country. I think he's shown some truer colors in terms of what he actually stands for. And so things have gotten worse, but nonetheless, Ethiopia to me is one of those places that's fluctuating significantly. There's lots of issues at play. There's certainly a China dimension, and the tech side in terms of how repression is used was fascinating. So that's kind of how I landed on those countries. And I'm happy to talk kind of more about what these case studies look like and some of the stories behind those. But I'm also conscious that I don't want to go on for too long. So let me kind of pivot and talk a little bit about some of the broader conclusions that that I derive from my research as a way to kind of then bridge to questions. So, first of all, without any question, whether authoritarian, whether a democratic country, whether in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Central Asia, the use of these tools, of digital repression tools, is a rising trend, and it cuts across all sorts of different factors. And so it's one of those aspects that's continuing to move forward pretty quickly. And I think it's one of those things where you just have to assume that with repression or with different political agendas will come a commensurate use of different types of technologies to consolidate power in a variety of contexts. Now, one of the things that I really kind of saw, kind of breaking down the data, is that there is a very close relationship to an authoritarian political system and the use of these tools. So, you can sort of say that if you're authoritarian, that will lead to a much higher likelihood that government will use different tools of censorship, surveillance, and so forth against its citizens. Now, but what is interesting is that within authoritarian countries, it's not monolithic by any means. And so you have a pretty sharp divergence in terms of how different types of authoritarian countries will use censorship strategies or surveillance strategies against their citizens. And it varies quite a bit from what you might see in a context like China to what you might see in another type of authoritarian context like Uganda, right? The other thing too is that while authoritarian countries are more likely to use digital repression tools, democracies also are increasingly reliant upon these tools. And some of the places where I'm most interested or concerned about globally, countries like India or Turkey, are countries that are still considered to be democracies. Certainly, India are increasingly dealing with illiberal populist tendencies by their leadership, and you can see how these tools, particularly disinformation tools, have become particularly relevant in terms of their governing strategies. Now, what was also an important question for the book is sort of looking at the effect of China. And China is one of those issues in terms of its role where there's a lot of different ways you can slice and think about what kind of impact they're having. on the one hand, I think, narratives that talk about how the China model of digital oppression, the use of mass surveillance, the use of advanced tools to track citizens, how that's something that increasingly is being looked on and is influencing use of these technologies in other countries. I think that's a fair case that you can make. And I think, a good way to describe that sort of parallel modeling, where countries aren't necessarily emulating what China is doing, but they are certainly drawing inspiration from what they're seeing within the country. At the same time, I think some of the more sort of popular narratives that China is directly working with, individual countries to push these technologies onto the regimes in order to sort of enact or fulfill a grand vision of digital authoritarianism. That's something that I just didn't see evidence of. When I talk to intelligence officials, politicians, government officials, civil society, I found many more local factors on the ground. Political needs, the level of sophistication of intelligence services, political practices, political systems. All those were much more relevant factors when it came to determining whether a government would choose to use these tactics or not, as opposed to simply the relationship that it had with China. And I thought that was an important insight in terms of how far China's reach actually extended in terms of its influence about decision making in these countries. Now, one kind of big question or final question was and it's something I've been asked quite a bit, is to what extent are these technologies transformational when it comes to repression? Does it mean that when we look upon the ability of civil society, opposition movements to fight back, that we're sort of at the end of the road, and that these technologies will give a decisive edge to repressive governments? And I have a couple of kind of thoughts on that. On the one hand, I would say that in certain narrow instances where you already have a sophisticated security apparatus with a very cohesive command and control structure and discipline agents sort of at your disposal, like a China, maybe like a Russia to some extent, I think the landscape, the environment will be very difficult, increasingly hard for opposition groups, for civic activists to fight back in. And so in that sense, I think in narrow instances like that, some of the Gulf states would be another example. I think that the deck is increasingly getting stacked against these sort of homegrown democracy movements. But I think that those are more the exception than the rule. I think for the vast bulk of other countries, it's much more fluid in terms of both the ability of security forces to really, make actionable the intelligence and the data that's collected, as well as sort of, new adaptive ways that civic groups are constantly coming up with in order to push back, whether it's exposing corruption, whether it's documenting abuses via smartphones and smuggling out that footage so that, the world can sort of see that. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting, innovative ways that we're seeing groups fight back. And so in that sense, I would say, my own sort of judgment is less that we're in a new era where digital repression is the norm and that civic movements and dissent are on the wane. Rather, I think of it more as a cat and mouse struggle, where we'll see instances or cycles of autocratic resurgence, of more effective use of these tools, but we'll also see civic movements adapt and find new ways to innovate and push back. And so let me stop on that point and turn it over to Luke. And I look forward to our conversation and your questions. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Steve, and everybody. As we traditionally do here at PCFR, please feel free to either put a question in the chat or raise your hand, or otherwise, and would have you ask some questions of Steve. I do have a couple myself. I'd love to at least one to start with, and then again, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or otherwise, and we'll make sure to bring you on. Steve, one thing that I thought was particularly interesting was, I believe, in your chapter on the Philippines, you talked a lot about the responsibility of social media networks. In particular, you were talking about Facebook and stopping digital repression happening on their platforms. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the responsibility of these platforms are, so Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and should there be a national or international body responsible for overseeing companies like Facebook?
Right. Yeah, no, that remains a question that I continue to grapple with, particularly given how much these questions affect kind of our own domestic politics here in the United States. And what's interesting about Facebook is that I think you can make a couple, you can make a kind of couple points in terms of its role in the Philippines and its politics. First of all, there is a good chance that Duterte wouldn't have been elected without Facebook's help, in the sense that he was running an underdog campaign. He didn't have access to the normal tradition of mass media outlets, and really he didn't have that much name recognition across the country. What Duterte was able to do was assemble a crack social media team and essentially be the one to exploit Facebook in order to get his message out, to get his populist appeals out, and it caught like wildfire. And he became, sort of this unlikely kind of folk hero that ended up making it all the way into the presidential palace. And so what he's done since that time is that he's continued to directly exploit messaging, propaganda, and harassing his critics online, primarily through Facebook. And so in that sense, I think there's sort of two ways to think of it. On the one hand, we can't disaggregate Facebook's role from Duterte's rise. We can't separate those out and sort of say, well, it just coincidence that he happened to use Facebook. There's very much an intertwining, an interaction between the two that's relevant in a situation. On the other hand, I'm also hesitant to kind of fully place culpability on Facebook because, populists, especially in weak democratic environments, do well and they find ways to ascend. And in some instances, social media abets their rise. In many other instances, they find alternative means to get their message out. So to sort of simply say, well, all we need to do in a situation like the Philippines is ban Facebook, and then we'll sort of solve the political issues that are in play, I think is far too simplistic of a solution. So I think then that kind of gets to what Luke was mentioning, which is that we got to find a way to kind of both work through these problems, figure out what are some solutions that'll better help, when it comes to platform accountability, when it comes to greater responsiveness to, disinformation and false news that circulates. How can you find a way through that to bring about the kind of reforms that are necessary to essentially protect democracy in a country that is reeling from a deluge of false information? And so I do think that like figuring out a way forward on that front is vital. I think that Facebook has done incrementally better than it has in the past in the Philippines. But there are some structural problems that are just that I think make the situation continue to be pretty dismal. So.
Thanks, Steve. I couldn't agree with you more. I want to move case studies over to Thailand. And specifically, you talked a lot about the Future Forward Party. First, I'm going to ask, can you just define what that is to our group here? And then just very quickly, the Future Forward Party was formally dissolved by the Thai courts. And what was so interesting about that from your research was that not only did the sentiments that were unleashed by the party, the kind of resistance movement itself, not only did it persevere, even though they were formally dissolved, but they grew in momentum. They became more and more prevalent, and their validity and their recognition throughout the country became more abundant. At what point, can you talk about what the Future Forward Party was and what they stood for? And then can you talk about at what point is it maybe counterproductive for governments to kind of shut down these subversive organizations or actors?
Yeah, great question. So, when I arrived in Thailand for the study, so the Future Forward Party sort of arose, kind of out of nowhere, and it became one of the leading vote getters in the elections that had just been held. And what was interesting about them is that they represented this really large youth bloc. They relied primarily on social media to organize and kind of get people into, to vote and to do rallies. And they were led by this telegenic billionaire, a guy named Thanatorn, who really were just very blunt about criticizing the monarchy and the king, and taking on the military establishment, which, in Thailand in particular, are really sacrosanct in terms of what you can say and how you can criticize. So they broke a lot of third rails in that regard. And they were also kind of one of those classic social media online initiated movements that kind of caught like wildfire, inspired the youth, and really rode that wave to a very strong showing in elections. And so they upended the kind of political calculus of the ruling establishment. And it was not surprising to me at all that, less than a year later, the courts decided that for a variety of reasons, the Future Forward Party would be banned. And so, as Luke mentions, then what's happened is that rather than sort of, kind of douse the fire, the youth across different demographics, income brackets, backgrounds got really inflamed, and they have hit the streets in huge numbers. There's really, I think, a crisis of confidence at the moment when it comes to the monarchy and what will happen next. There are a lot of other reasons for why the monarchy has sort of undermined its own credibility, but certainly the fact that the heavy-handedness in terms of how Future Forward was dealt with, and people's feeling that that was too much, that their own voice and agency were completely disregarded by the government, I think has led to this kind of ongoing political crisis. And so it kind of is an interesting situation where you can see in certain countries, all of a sudden, the natural response is turn to coercion. Well, sometimes coercion works, especially if you're willing to really take things as far as you need to in terms of mass imprisonment and even killings. But in a situation where you are doing something like banning, but are not willing to go all the way, it can absolutely backfire. And I think that's what we're seeing in Thailand currently.
Wonderful. Thanks, Steve. Again, folks, I'm going to ask one more question here, and then please, happy to open this up to the group here. So please feel free to put a question in the chat or raise your hand, and I will call on you when we get to. Last question I really want to ask Steve is, whilst reading the book, I found it particularly alarming that a lot of the repression tactics that you were talking about felt all too familiar here at home. Can you talk a little bit about, or maybe give advice or warnings to, what would you say to an American elected official about what's happening here and how it relates to some of the repression tactics that you've seen around the world?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And the Philippines chapter in particular, I think, holds some warnings for how the manipulation of information can really do damage to a democracy. And in that context, you saw where a leader who spouted lots of populist appeals that oftentimes had very little to do with reality or facts. So much of the propaganda that came out were tied to false images, or were just kind of blatant, inflammatory rhetoric that it didn't really matter what he would say, but it was just that he would pick on a particular government critic. It could be a journalist like Maria Ressa. It could be an opposition politician like Leila de Lima. And then you would just get this pile-on effect where, like, people, because they liked Duterte and they thought his machismo was really something to emulate, would sort of just say awful things online. And that online poisonous rhetoric translated offline pretty quickly. And so then you saw the government feeling fairly empowered to pick up and detain and arrest different critics on spurious charges, to enact a drug war that's killed over 30,000 people. And so you can sort of see kind of where that goes. And I think, what that sort of says is a couple of things. I mean, one of which is that I think the Achilles heel for a lot of democracies, and the kind of sort of flawed assumption we've made, is that the marketplace of ideas will ultimately allow for truth to prevail. And, maybe that is true in certain circumstances, but certainly in a social media inflamed environment, that doesn't seem to win out a large part of the time. So we can't assume that just because you stand for facts and evidence, that's suddenly going to be the type of rhetoric that people listen to. Certainly in the Philippines, it's not been the case. I think, second of all, as well, it just sort of shows you that information distortion is something that we have to take seriously. When we sort of say, okay, you're cutting off people's ability to say anything, that's censorship. Or when we have mass surveillance and there's video cameras, these feel very visceral and physical and real. But when you sort of see people putting out memes that push a false idea, somehow we don't put that in the same category. And yet the ultimate outcome in terms of harms to democracy are just as salient at the end of the day. And I think that's something that the Philippines illustrates to us. And certainly, we can also look here at home and sort of say, as false messages come out and as they spread and as they cause people to do things that are anti-democratic and violent, I think we have to question, what that means for our own system and whether we need to kind of rethink some of the basic tenets we use when it comes to stopping disinformation and a balance between security, freedom of expression, and public rhetoric. So I think it's opened up a lot of questions that we have to closely scrutinize in our own society, and that's unfortunate, but it's also needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Ambassador Hartwick, we got your question here, but give me one sec. I had a question that was direct messaged to me here, and it says, can you talk a little bit about, this was a very heavily, your talks so far have been very heavy on social media, in terms of political inclusion and getting people involved in the process. What role does the internet and social media companies have to maybe increase voter turnout around the world, including here in the US and otherwise? What is the utility in the context of young people, basically, of social media and inclusion in the political process? And then
Yeah.
we're coming to you next.
Yeah, no, it's really a double-edged sword. And, it's sort of like, I think we've sort of talked about two examples which showcase both sides of that aspect. So, on the one hand, we talked about Thailand and the use of social media to both power a new opposition movement that really is pro-democratic in terms of its sensibilities and inclusive, the Future Forward Party and whatever, kind of next incarnations come about. And without social media, I'm sure, in fact, because you can look back on the history of Thailand and see how these types of movements have developed or not developed. I'm sure that social media has played a critical role in allowing that type of political mobilization to occur. So, without a question, it's not a clear-cut case where, I'm arguing social media is bad. I mean, ultimately, it's a function of how people use it, and to what extent algorithms are exploited in positive or negative ways, and what are the motivations of those who actually design and run these platforms to begin with. And so in that sense, I think you very clearly can see in the Thailand situation, in some other contexts like Arab Spring and, what happened with Egypt, but even sort of more contemporary, examples, Sudan, Armenia, and so forth. There very much is, I think, a virtuous power of political resistance and organization that in the best of times can really make a difference when it comes to social media. But it's just that, and this is kind of part of the larger meta narrative of the book, it's just that governments are not going to stay complacent. They're not going to sit around and sort of say, oh, look at this. It looks like, people are organizing over social media to resist, the government and to try to challenge our rule. So let's just sort of see how this evolves. They're going to take proactive steps to co-opt narratives, which they've traditionally done, to distort and change around information, to breed cynicism, so that people get to a point where they can't really tell what's true or what's false, and they just tune out. And that's actually a very classic Russian or Soviet approach when it comes to information. Make it so you can't really tell, poison the well of information such that people end up just saying, you know what, I'm not even going to bother. And so, I guess what I would say, kind of a long answer to your question, is that information has been manipulated for decades. It's an age-old concept. Social media is a new battlefront in terms of things, information being able to move more quickly. But a lot of the concepts that we're talking about, date back, into the pre-internet age, frankly.
Wonderful. Thanks, Steve. This next question comes from Ambassador Doug Hartwick, who just a little bit of background on you, Steve. Ambassador Hartwick was the ambassador of Laos from 2001 to, I believe, 2004. He says, digital repression has been around for a long time in some countries. Did your research find that this repression is dynamic, that it has become more sophisticated in its application?
Yeah, no, it's really good question. And certainly it has. And I think, that part of that is just the fact that the tools themselves have changed quite a bit. So, let's take something that wasn't really widely available up until less than a decade ago. So forget even like social media for a second, but look at something like encrypted communications via Telegram or Signal, which in many places like Belarus today, Myanmar, but also in our own domestic context, these encrypted apps are being used by different groups of people to organize in a somewhat safer manner than kind of the more public ways that people communicate with each other via Facebook or Twitter. And so, that to me sort of illustrates the dynamism and innovation that's inherent in how technology evolves, in the sense that as people have realized that governments can read and penetrate and manipulate what's being said on more public platforms, encrypted apps have gained in popularity because it offers a more protected space, particularly in closed environments like Belarus, to be able to resist to the extent possible. Now what's actually interesting with Belarus is that we see just how important Telegram is to the fact that you had the leader of a Telegram opposition channel, the Nexta channel, hijacked from a plane just 10 days ago. So to me, that's the evolution that we're seeing. To think that someone whose relevance to an encrypted application would be the subject of an international hostage-taking incident, involving MiG fighters, is really sort of something I think we would have laughed about 10 years ago as completely unlikely, and now is the reality that we're in. So it is very dynamic. I certainly would agree with that.
Wonderful, thank you. Sophie, I see your question in the chat, but I'm going to quickly, I'll come back to you, I promise, but I'm going to transition to my friend Florian Hernandez, who's joining us actually from Utah and runs a really awesome nonprofit where they're doing great work in the Philippines. Florian, I'll pass it over to you if you want to tell us just very briefly about the work you do, and then go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, Steve. Like Leek said, my name is Florian. I'm the executive director for Philippines Humanitarian here in Utah. We're a US-based 501c3. But our mission is to educate really impoverished students in the Philippines so that they can complete their education and help them escape the cycle of poverty. I was really looking forward to this Zoom meeting today because it was of great interest about the rise of digital repression. And as I've been reading, and I need to do more research because I'm not as versed as Steve on technology in the Philippines, but they don't have a great rating as far as accessibility. And of course, the things that Duterte has been doing with the infrastructure of the internet and, banning journalists and media from criticizing his works. I was just kind of curious, and I haven't read your book, but I'm looking forward to doing that. I want to know, your title is The Rise of Digital Repression, but yet you're quite optimistic as to hopefully that this doesn't continue to rise. Can you kind of give us a sense of things that these populations, especially in these countries like the Philippines, can do to combat digital repression? We're seeing things like Apple in China, that they're making concessions towards the Chinese government. I mean, any companies moving into countries like China or the Philippines, especially technology companies, wouldn't they have to comply with the government's rules and regulations? I'd just be interested to know what your take is on that and what can be done.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. And, I guess I would say it's not that I'm optimistic that digital repression will be overcome, but it's that I'm equally not pessimistic that there's no way for citizens to push back. And, my kind of bottom line premise is that I think when it comes to digital repression, I'm not a technological determinist, and that I think that the use of technology for political survival purposes by leaders is rooted in politics ultimately. And so just as Duterte came into power, sure, he manipulated information, and sure, that helped power his rise, but ultimately I think a good campaign on the ground grassroots work, and hopefully a little more accountability from social media platforms to enable more of an even playing field, when it comes to tamping down the worst of disinformation can lead to better outcomes. Where I would say, so where I'm pessimistic are in closed authoritarian environments like China's, where I don't see any real prospect for political opening or reform in the near future. And I feel that you have to sort of understand and accept the nature of what repression looks like in that context, and then deal with it accordingly. And frankly, I think that means for companies like Apple, as you mentioned, they ought to be held to greater scrutiny for the choices that they've made in terms of dealing with the regime and allowing for those trade-offs to occur because they want to have access to the market. I find that pretty troubling. But I think in other situations, especially in places that are weaker democracies, but where there still is a tradition of pushing back, of resistance, and so forth, I do think that there are opportunities and ways for citizens to get together and to find ways to resist. And I think you'll continue to see that. I don't think we're just going to look at a situation in the next decade where it's purely authoritarians exploiting technology and citizens not being able to have a response. I don't think that's what we'll find.
Great. Thanks, Florian. Thanks, Steve. Sophie, this is an entire book. So instead, would you mind coming on and asking your question yourself?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. So I really enjoyed your point with regards to the idea that although we are seeing this rise in digital repression, these same technological tools do provide avenues for citizens to kind of fight back against this. But at the same time, I also think of cases like the recent law that we saw passed in France, which prohibits publishing the films of police officers. And that has often been used as, say, activists have used that to highlight police abuses, but now that's going to be outlawed. So my question for you is, do you think we see this risk of these different ways of using technology to counter repression, that they're just going to be outlawed by governments or restricted by governments as they do arise?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. It's a really great question, and it's a tough one to answer. But I would say one thing that we're seeing a rise of is sort of a proliferation and a trend of legal persecution tied to the use of these technologies. Where take something like the trend of fake news laws that governments are enacting around the world. Right? They saw an opening where they said, okay, we have you're so worried about disinformation. We're going to ban it, but we're going to make the idea of what fake news is so discretionary to the government that really anything that's critical of the government will demand that social media platforms take down. And so there you see a real perversion of a well-meaning concept to some extent into something that essentially just is another legal persecution tool. And you're seeing that around the world in countries throughout. I mean, likewise, in authoritarian contexts like Russia, you're seeing the increasing use of legal persecution regulations, that are sort of banning different platforms, different media outlets, and so forth, whether under cyber libel laws or other types of premises. So certainly, you're right. Like this is something that is, I think, part of the tip of the spear when it comes to the struggle. At least in places like France and other liberal democracies in particular, I think one of the nice things about these sort of legal provisions that are misdirected or misguided is that systems have a built-in mode of appeal and a way to push back. And if there's enough outrage and public backlash about the effect that such laws have, one hopes that you then are able to kind of get something better in place. So that with abuse and exploitation oftentimes comes reform and correction. And we've seen that in our own country with, for example, take FISA laws and intelligence abuses that actually then reined in our intelligence agencies. So at least in democracies, I have a greater confidence that what you've described is something that can be pushed back on. In authoritarian contexts, I think it's a lot trickier.
That's interesting, Steve. I really appreciate that as well. Next is Jacob. Direct message.
Hey, Steve, want to get back to, can you hear me?
Yep, I got it.
Okay, good. Been having trouble. Get back to the misinformation piece. So one famous quote from history is, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. It seems like some misinformation, like the big lie, are just maintaining their momentum despite every date that former President Trump was supposed to retake office in mid-January to March to now August is passing by without incident. What are some of the steps that everyone here today can take to fight misinformation, things like the big lie? I mean, arguing with people on Facebook has never changed anyone's opinion. So what else can we do?
Yeah. Well, I don't have any easy solutions to that. I mean, to be honest, I mean, especially some of the news that we're seeing these days, including I think a recent poll from Ipsos that showed that the tenets of QAnon are now followed or agreed to by 12% of the U.S. population, or at least those who are surveyed. I mean, these are things that are just really disturbing on so many different levels. I mean, there are some classic answers people will give. Digital literacy, better civic education in your schools, being able to sift truth from fiction and so forth. And I think on a long term, those certainly make a lot of sense. But I mean, I think when it comes down to it, is that I think social media, you can't only look at social media as the cause for what's happening. I think you have to look at some broader factors and kind of approach those. So one is polarization. Why is there a point right now where there's such identity-based politics and people are choosing to group with others and peddle lies? Is it because they are attracted to the lies, or they are attracted to the affiliation of identifying with these groups for a variety of reasons? And if so, what are those reasons? I think a second thing is we also have to look at the interaction between mass media and social media. So for example, the different narratives that have been peddled on social media, many of them actually didn't originate on social media. Many are actually originated in the kind of Fox News, OMN, talk radio ecosystem, something that was developed and cultivated for decades before you actually had the rise of Facebook as a viable means. So I think we have to kind of look back and sort of say, how did you actually see this type of conservative information ecosystem develop? How did it get so perverted by the type of disinformation you described? And then what are ways that people, especially and starting with conservatives who might have a point of view that they think is important, but are not interested in the trafficking of falsehoods, how can they actually take back that narrative within the group? And I think these are the kind of questions we have to ask. So unfortunately, no easy solutions, but you're asking the right questions. I'd certainly agree.
Thanks, Steve. Because I want to be consistent with time and make sure we have time for our book giveaway here at the end, I'm going to ask one question that's in the chat. And Phil, I know you have a question. If you want to close us off, Steve, if we can keep the answers short so we don't run out of time here. First question is, can you talk about digital repression in India and what's happening there, if anything at all? And Phil, if you want to come in and ask a final question. You're muted, my friend. Yeah, you need to unmute. There you go.
Did you want me to unmute?
Perfect.
I can hear
Okay.
you. You're good.
All right, so my question, Stephen, is whether or not you would agree or disagree with this observation. We talk about authoritarian governments that are making decisions and then are using the digital technology in order to repress or to persuade. Do you see the rise of the use of executive orders versus the Congress making delayed decisions as a movement in the United States towards more authoritarian decision-making, and therefore why the media could be perhaps more negatively persuasive?
Okay. I'll start with Luke, your question, then quickly discuss Phil's, and I'll be brief. So on India, India absolutely is, to me, if there's a country that I'm most interested in watching, India is probably top of the list, because a little bit of everything is taking place. You're seeing the advent of more mass surveillance techniques. You're seeing a restriction of online space, including recent raids on Twitter. You're seeing this happen in parallel with a growing amount of populist and liberalism by Modi. And India is so important, so big, and really leading the world in kind of a hybrid form of digital repression. So it's a place that I am in contact with a lot of researchers there. I'd like to go and understand better and watch where these trends are going. But it is top of the list for me in terms of where all these issues are coming to roost, from disinformation to surveillance. So it's a great point. Phil, in your question, I think I certainly understand the arguments, having worked in, the executive branch and in Congress, when it comes to the balance between executive orders and congressional legislative action. It's a different issue when it comes to digital repression. I think you can certainly make valid points about, is the reliance on executive orders a good for U.S. democracy? And to some extent, it's not. Although you can also argue that a broken Congress that's unable to pass, needed legislation is also bad for democracy. So where do you start? That's a whole other conversation. But I think you've highlighted something that is worth some deeper thought about. So I'll leave it there with that and turn it back over to you, Luke.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Steve. Thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it. This was so engaging, enjoyable for me, and for, I'm sure, all of us. Thanks for your time. I'll give you the closing remarks here, but we really deeply appreciate your time. This was great.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you all. This is really just a great conversation and my first raffle of my own book. So I can't tell you how gratifying that is, but I look forward to continuing the conversation, and you can always reach me. Luke can send my information out if you have any follow-up. Thanks for the time again, and let's keep thinking about these issues.
Steve, we'll have you back for the next book, huh?
Sounds good. Whenever that time comes.
Thanks, everybody.